Young activists are playing a major part to highlight the crisis. We met one woman leading the fight against climate change in Nigeria.
My name is Charlene Watson. I'm an eco-feminist, climate justice activist, and an eco-reporter.
Using a video blog as her fighting tool.
My name is Charlene Watson. I'm the founder of ID Climate Action Initiative from Nigeria. And we have always been talking about climate finance. What does it mean? The loss and damage funds now that has been operationalized in Dubai at COP28. And there's a lot of issues or information people need to know about it. Are we on track? Are we meeting the commitment on climate finance? What more do we need to do in order for us to meet up with our commitment? And so I have a very brilliant actor in this field that has a lot of expertise over the years. And she's a senior associate at ODI. Her name is Charlene Watson, and she's going to be giving us much information on climate finance because I've been a Nigerian youth delegate at the United Nations Conference of Party on climate finance, but we all need to understand more and in-depth understanding about it. And so she's going to be spotlighting the issue on climate finance. So thank you so very much for honoring my invitation. I'm really happy that you're here to tell us more about it. So we'll start with you telling us about yourself, what's your field on climate finance, and what more do we need to know about you? Thank you.
Thanks, Adeniki. It's great to be here. I'm Charlene Watson. I'm a senior research associate at ODI. I've been working in climate finance, broadly defined, for the last decade. And the debate has become a lot more complicated over that decade. At first, we were talking about multilateral climate change funds, their establishment, where the money was coming from, where the money was going, and trying to make them effective. Then we had the Paris Agreement. We were talking about funding nationally determined contributions. And now, more recently, we've been talking about how to make all finance flows climate consistent, how the international financial system needs to be reformed to work for sustainable development and climate benefits. And so the conversation has become a lot more complicated. And also, I'm very happy to speak to you because I find that while there's a lot of technical issues when it comes to climate finance, there's also a whole host of political issues. And some of those are not easy to read about why things evolved in a certain way. So it's always great to have conversation. Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so very much. Just like you said, you can't understand it when you even read it. You have to be in it. You have to have the conversation, which we want to have today. So my first question to you will be, what is the state of climate finance today? Do you think we are making progress enough, or we need to do more, maybe from the global perspective, national, regional, or even local levels? What more do we need to do, or what more do we need to give in order to meet up with our climate finance obligations?
So firstly, climate finance definition is a real problem because it was never defined. Different parties, constituencies, NGOs, people, they count different things. So it's very difficult to say where we are when it comes to climate finance. However, the Climate Policy Initiative estimates about 1.3 trillion in climate finance annually in 2021 and 2022. So this is global. This is everything everywhere, and it's mostly the primary investment. It's majority mitigation, mostly for energy and then for transport, much less in buildings and industry, and even less for adaptation. So around 63 billion of that 1.3 trillion is going for adaptation, and much of that is for water and waste and sanitation. The other thing to note that while that number is getting bigger over the years, it's partly because our data is improving. So as well as the amount going up, the amount of information we have is also going up. So it's hard to actually see the increases year on year. But from what we do know, most of that primary investment is in developed countries and East Asia. In terms of that from developed to developing countries, as articulated under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement and in the Convention, the OECD estimated around 89.6 billion in 2021. So again, this is growing, but it's growing very, very slowly. And that includes bilateral climate finance, multilateral public and export credits, mobilized private climate finance. And that is less than the 100 billion a year, although the OECD have stated that they think the 100 billion will be met in 2022 when they get that data, and most certainly in 2023. It's a lot less than any developing country's estimated needs, but I'd like to be clear here that we don't have a formula that links total developing country financing needs with the amount of flows and the estimates that I've been giving you. So there's a lot of uncertainty, for example, in how much public finance is needed to mobilize the scale of private finance that we need. In
Okay,
terms
so
of,
okay, you
you
can
asked
continue.
a question about
Yeah,
doing
so in
more.
terms of defining climate finance, so I want to understand what that means, if it has been defined now, or they are still looking for how to better define it. And when it comes to the loss and damage, are they trying to also define it as well? If yes, what are the criteria, the basis for defining the loss and damage funds?
In terms of in the UNFCCC process, there is an ongoing discussion on the climate finance definition. And this discussion is happening on the Standing Committee on Finance, which is a body that supports both the COP and the CMA. The discussion has been ongoing for some time now. And in general, the debate is around the provider and the recipient. So is it just developed to developing countries? Flows that count as climate finance, or should it be everything generally? Because of course there will be domestic finance that goes towards climate action, and countries might want recognition for that. It could be who gets the money. So I might be working as a researcher on a climate finance issue in Nigeria, but I live in Switzerland and my institution is based in London. So does it count as climate finance for Nigeria if a research report is being done somewhere else in the world by an international consultant, for example? And another thing is, does it count if you're giving it to the private sector, or should it just be public to public flows? So there's a lot of different ways in which kind of it could count. And is it only grants? Is it export credits? Should guarantees count? There's a lot of other questions there. It's also complicated because they're on the ground. You use finance to live, to thrive, to go about your day-to-day business, whether it's jobs, transport, infrastructure, health. So you don't always make that separation as to what is climate and what is not. So at the ground level, it's very hard to distinguish, for example, when you build a road infrastructure, and maybe you use certain cement or you put flood irrigation at the side. Is that development finance? Is that climate finance? Or is that just normal public spending? So it is actually very hard to define at the local level too. And we have this big complication between adaptation and development. As you say, now that we have loss and damage, we have another additional element of the complication between ex ante adaptation, ex post adaptation, and then what's going to be loss and damage. So if you're prepared, like an insurance or an insurance mechanism, whether or not you pay the premiums, is that adaptation? Is that loss and damage? Is that climate finance? And then post-disaster, is that humanitarian finance? Is that climate finance for adaptation, loss and damage? It's very, very complicated. I think fundamentally, if there was enough money for countries, we wouldn't need to worry too much about the definition. And what has happened to date is that each country, each provider, each channel, each country defines the way, recipient country defines the way about climate finance. So we have a number of taxonomies that are emerging that also help private sector engage, know what to do. And this is easier for mitigation because we have an activity list of things that count towards mitigation. Is much harder for adaptation, but we do see these taxonomies evolving. But in terms of, do we have one measure right now? We don't yet, no.
So you talked about tools like accountability on climate finance, and I just want you to dwell more on what are the tools put in place for us to be able to measure the amount of finance, climate finance that have flowed so far, or the areas at which it is going to. Why I'm asking this is because of the $100 billion annual commitment that was still debated even at COP28, of some country agreeing with the fact that they have met the goal and some said no. So what are the measures put in place to quantify if this has been done and if this $100 billion and other climate finance is administered in loan or in grants?
So the Standing Committee on Finance that I mentioned was asked last year to do a progress report on the 100 billion and the year before. So they have been trying to get to this question of has the 100 billion been met? Fundamentally, we're relying on the same underlying data sources. So when the OECD did their 100 billion report as well, their climate finance progress report, they fundamentally use a similar set of data. So in terms of what data is available, under the multilateral climate change agreement, developed countries are required to submit biennial reports, and those biennial reports have within the common tabular format data on climate finance provided through bilateral measures and multilateral measures, and also core general contributions, which can include that goes to the multilateral development banks or other big UN foundations and institutions. So the BRs, which will now become BTRs as the Enhanced Transparency Framework comes into play in 2024, those form the basis of countries self-reporting on climate finance, and developing countries voluntarily can report on the climate finance that it received. In addition to that, developed countries that are part of the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, they are required to report under the OECD systems. So the OECD system also calculates bilateral finance, which has climate-related objectives. So it's not officially climate finance, it's development finance with climate-related objectives. They also capture that provision to multilateral funds as well as the MDBs. On top of which, the MDBs, they do their own reporting on climate finance flows. And year on year, we have an increasing number of MDBs coming into that, which is interesting. So we have a breadth of multilateral development bank finance flows that are climate related. And then, of course, we have each of the multilateral climate change funds have their own reporting. The private sector reporting is a lot harder, and more or less we rely on climate policy initiatives, global climate finance landscape. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, so thank you so very much. So I don't know, maybe you could also spotlight the issue of how finance, because you mentioned when you were saying that the amount of finance given to developing countries is lesser than what the developed country receive. And looking at who bears the impact most is the developing country and some small island countries as well. And so I just want to know the measures of how much grants compared to the loan on climate finance that developing country receive. Because right now, developing country like even Nigeria and even others, they are feeling or they are indebted. They have a lot of debts to pay. And so that is also affecting the state of the economy right now. And so that is why I'm asking the amount of grants compared to a loan. Is the loan over or more than the grant given in terms of climate finance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. So the different channels, sources and modalities for providing climate finance are very different between themselves in terms of the financial instruments that they use. The multilateral climate change funds, which include those that form the core of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, they provide mostly grants. And they also provide a high proportion of grant finance for specifically adaptation and specifically for LDCs and SIDS that you've mentioned. When it comes to bilateral sources, this varies by donor. Some donors give 100% grants and others give less grants. In general, the grant basis is slightly less than multilateral climate change funds. Then when you shift to the MDBs that I've mentioned, the MDB financing is mostly concessional lending. And that means it's lending, but it's less than market rate lending. When it comes to increasing unsustainable sovereign debt in a number of developing countries, we absolutely need to think about the terms and conditions that climate finance is provided on. We also need to think about, I fully agree that we need more grant-based finance to developing countries, particularly for adaptation, particularly for the most vulnerable, and including for loss and damage. We do also need to think about what are the objectives of that climate finance. So if the objectives of that climate finance are to bring in private sector actors, we might actually usefully use other financial instruments. So for example, we can de-risk the private sector with public finance. And that might not be a grant. There might be a grant to support project development, but it might also be a guarantee, or it might be concessional lending that takes the first losses in any instance of any losses. So there are other ways in which we can think about how the public finance can be used in a financial instrument to really generate the outcomes we want, much bigger scales of private finance being involved. And then when it comes back to unsustainable sovereign debt, there are also other mechanisms that we can look at to change what's happening there. There have been some debt for climate swaps, but that's not necessarily available to every single country. But there are a number of initiatives that sit outside the UNFCCC that are looking at debt restructuring. That's another option. Another option would be looking at the terms and conditions on which finance is provided. So disaster clauses in debt, for example. So there's a pause in the servicing of debt if there is a climate-related disaster, so that countries that can use their liquidity in the time of a crisis to look after their people before they pay back any debts that are required. So let's just say that there are multiple solutions to this problem. And given that we need to finance some big transitions, we need all of the financial instruments to be at play. But we need to make sure that whatever financial instruments we pick, we don't push countries further into sovereign indebtedness. And when they have other crises hit, we can put a pause on any repayments of climate finance so that they can deal with thriving societies and looking after people first.
Yeah, you have a lot to share, and it could take us hours if we keep on, asking this question, which I find really interesting, useful, informative, and I know my audience is going to learn a lot from this interview. And just before I ask my last two questions, I just want to, you mentioned debt swap for, climate action and then debt restructuring. Could you just briefly tell us what that means? What measures is that put in place for vulnerable countries to be able to deal with their debt-related issues?
I'm not an expert in debt swaps, so I don't want to say anything wrong. But in general, when a country has a large amount of sovereign debt, it can try and bundle that into a bond. And then some of that debt gets restructured in a way that is forgiven, cancelled, or pays back differently if there are certain environmental and or climate key performance indicators that are met. So basically, it's a form of either restructuring or forgiveness of debt if the country can then use the money for climate and environmental outputs and prove that they have been met.
Thank you so very much. And so before I ask my last question, so this, talking about loss and damage, because it's one of the most important issue on climate finance right now. So I want to know, when they say it has been operationalized, has it truly been operationalized? And what do they mean by that term? Is it by giving the funds? And how soon will this fund be accessible to the most vulnerable countries or communities? And how do they want to operate? Because at the subsidiary board meeting in the pre-COP in Bonn, there was a lot of different countries coming up with their own kind of measures or ways it could be given. Some agree the fact that it should be given to the community directly, some through the government. Like, what measures do they want to put in place in order for these funds to reach the most vulnerable? And yeah.
So the creation of the fund has been a really historical moment, included for climate justice. So, and it's also went very fast. So between COP27 and agreeing to establish new funding arrangements, to kind of all the debates on the modalities that happened last year, all the way through to the governing instrument being agreed and approved at COP28 in Dubai. So this was very fast for our process, and it came after decades of efforts towards loss and damage. So firstly, it is a very historical moment. And the fact that we got 661 million US dollars in pledges to the fund by 18 countries in the European Commission was almost the fastest that any fund has ever been kind of capitalized. What we need to remember, however, is that the fund design still has a long way to go. So a lot of debates about the points you raised were had in 2023. How is the money, what should the money be used for? Through what modalities will the money flow to local level? Who are the most vulnerable that need to get the money first? All of these things were discussed, but also remain to be set into the policies of the fund. And so the fund will need to do a lot of work this year to really establish the results frameworks and those kind of activity taxonomies that you've been talking about. It will also need to really work hard to look at what modalities exist to get funding down to local level, and how that will need to either change the way the fund is capitalized or the change systems and processes through which the fund, the money gets down to the ground in country, which national systems can be used and reinforced in country to make that happen. So the World Bank is going to hopefully host the fund for 4 years if it has to agree to certain conditions around having an independent board and a secretariat. So we will see a lot of that work happening this year. And what we actually need is that countries, communities, and civil society continue to articulate their needs. So what are the needs on the ground? And what are the different modalities and mechanisms that could best meet those needs? And how can then we make sure that the system, the loss and damage fund, and the wider climate finance architecture can serve those needs? What is the best thing for the fund to do versus other climate finance and loss and damage sources, and how they can do it? So quite frankly, the answer to your question is there's a lot to be designed, but we mustn't sit back and wait for it to be designed. We can influence its design and help working on the policies that best serve the people on the ground.
So just finally, the final question for this interview, like, what do you think the measures we could employ or exploit in order for us to make the most use on climate finance to progress more? What are the methods? Because right now we are still not there in order to meet up with this obligation. What do we need to do differently from world leaders, or what do you think we are not getting right when it comes to climate finance that is affecting us reaching the most vulnerable and making the most impact?
Yeah. So we need to continue to put a lot of pressure on all countries to mitigate, with developed countries leading on mitigation efforts, because the more we fail to mitigate, the higher the costs of adaptation damages are going to be. So we do really need to make sure we're ambitious with mitigation. Of course, we can't expect people to worry about mitigating tomorrow if they're not surviving today. So, adaptation has been recognized as a global issue. And given the way that integrated supply chains and trade is these days, this is really important that we help everybody to adapt, because you need to thrive today to worry about the mitigation of tomorrow and your system tomorrow. So that's really important, to make sure that adaptation stays high on the agenda. And also we continue to pressure all countries, and particularly developed countries, to continue to mitigate and support global adaptation efforts. Of course, within that, we need to continue to pressure developed country governments to increase their pledges to climate finance. And we have this year, and we've had for the last 2 years, deliberations around a new collective quantified goal on climate finance that will replace the 100 billion. We need to put some pressure to make sure that that is not only a good quantity, but is also quality finance. You talked a lot about access to the financial instrument. It needs to not only be a quantity figure, but we need to also think about how we want that finance to look when it comes to quality. So we can continue to work on those areas. As citizens as well, we need to make sure finance is complicated. There are many different channels, flows, and interacting incentives. So it's not just what's happening at the international level, those international public flows that are going to be important. And I wanted to give you an example. If you decide to get healthy, maybe you pay to join a gym, and that costs. Maybe you buy more fruit and vegetables at the supermarket, and that costs money. And that you can almost count it as your climate finance spending, right? It's your health spending that you're trying to do a good thing. But what we're counting less. You'd probably also consider buying less processed food. Maybe you would buy a bit less. I would buy a bit less chocolate. Maybe I wouldn't buy my sugary drinks. And when it comes to climate finance, are we really thinking about that side of things enough? Are we thinking enough about the finance that flows in the other direction? If climate policy initiatives say we've got 1.3 trillion going to climate finance globally, but our needs and investment are 8 trillion, that money exists. That money is in the system. The IPCC sixth assessment report is very clear. It's not that we need more money in the system as a whole. We just need to redirect the money that is there. That money is going to be spent. The question of how we spend it is important. And so when you say, what else can we do? There are many other things to look at. Where is the money that's going against our goal going, and how is it incentivized? So, you're trying to get healthy. You can't get an electric bike because it's too expensive. So you continue to take the bus. The government has made it really cheap to sell crisps and fizzy drinks because they've subsidized certain companies or farmers. Fruit and veg is really expensive. So the government rules that are in the country where you are change the prices. They change the costs of what you're doing. Same for climate. Not just fossil fuel subsidies, agricultural subsidies, water pricing, tax exemptions on hurricane shutters. All of these smaller things are very important. And we as citizens can pressure our governments to do certain things to enable climate finance to flow in the right direction. On top of that, fast food companies keep advertising to me on my way to work. Supermarkets are putting chocolate bars at the till, and I can't resist. Right. And this is even though the supermarkets and the fast food chains are telling me they're going to be healthy. So private actors want to make profit. And, the climate problem is their concern because it questions their model, their supply chains. But we need to pressure them to do more. We can really pressure them by our consumption decisions as individuals and consumers. Of course, this is just an example, and it doesn't really consider equity and the historical responsibility for climate change. But it just shows you that we can really hold our governments to account. We can also hold our private institutions, the corporates, the finance institutions as an individual. What is your bank doing? What does your university do? What is your wallet doing when you go to the supermarket? Like, these are all things we can actually do as everyday people. So we need to continue to pressure the system. And the equity for climate finance provision, climate action, but we can also do everyday things in our countries to make sure that finance is flowing in the right direction for the transition.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for your time as well. And thank you for this conversation, for exposing the issue or speaking more on the issue on climate finance. And I know my audience are able to understand better from different angles what the climate finance talks about, and they're able to work on this basis for them to be able to better know how to demand for accountability, how to come in when it comes to climate finance and all. And so thank you so much, Charlene, for your time. I'm really happy that you're able to honor my invitation, despite your busy schedule, and your expertise is really very good and could also spotlight issues on climate finance, because climate finance is like a cut-crossing issue. We need it for gender-related issues, for innovation, technology. And so every aspect needs climate finance now. It's how it needs to flow, just as you stated. And once there's a deficiency that we have in maybe adaptation or mitigation, it just affects the whole thing. And so thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate, and we are looking forward to another time with you as well.
Thanks a lot, Adenike. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to discuss this topic. I could talk all day. Thank you so much.
Okay.